is a video about why defining atheism as a lack of belief in God is a bad idea.
This again. Oh, rapture. Let's do this. Greetings, fellow space travelers, BionicDance here. And much as I would prefer to not argue with another atheist, I'm afraid this is a subject about which I have some semi-strong feelings, and I feel the need to defend my position. So, here we go.
Here, roughly, is how I define atheism. Where G is the proposition that God exists, and where a doxastic attitude is a belief about a proposition, and where 0 means certainly false and 1 means certainly true, then my definition of an atheist is X is an atheist if and only if X has doxastic attitude A to G and A expresses a probability of less than 0.5.
Which actually does not describe atheism the way you want it to according to the rest of your video. There are two things you might want to swap around. You see, if X is the subject under scrutiny that may or may not be an atheist, and if A is the variable that describes their attitude, their certainty to whether or not a God exists, then if it's A that expresses a probability, then that's just a variable. It's not the subject itself expressing this belief, but rather the variable doing it. In other words, as this is worded in this specific context, the word expresses might as well be equals. A equals a probability of less than 0.5. So if, as I pointed out earlier, doxastic just means of or relating to belief, then your criterion of X has a doxastic attitude of A towards G really says nothing more than that X's attitude towards the proposition that God exists has to be less than 0.5. It doesn't actually say anything about whether that belief is knowing or unknowing, stated or unstated. All it really says is check the variable A against the numeric criterion necessary to qualify as an atheist. It also doesn't say anything about whether X is a living, conscious, knowing being. All it says is that X is the subject under scrutiny. Now don't get me wrong, I realize that's not what you meant, but if you're going to be telling people your definition of atheist, it helps to be precise.
So, on this analysis, there is no possible situation in which something has an attitude towards the proposition God exists that puts its odds at less than 50%, but wherein that thing is not an atheist. Nor is there a situation in which a thing is an atheist, but wherein it does not put the odds on God's existing at less than 50%.
But again, this is where you and I part ways, because as I see it, if the probability is less than 50%, whether it's deliberate or not, that is what it takes to be an atheist, because it doesn't qualify as a theist. You see, theist describes what something is. To not be a theist, to not have that word apply to you, the only thing necessary is to not meet the criterion necessary to be a theist. Let's look at a suitable analogy. Subject under scrutiny X owns a Toyota Prius. They meet every criterion necessary to be a Prius owner. They are a Priusist. Subject under scrutiny Y, however, does not own a Toyota Prius. They do not meet the criterion necessary to be a Prius owner. They are without Prius. They are an A Priusist. So if this circle represents all that qualify, that meet the necessary criteria to be a Prius owner, then you know what's in the other circle? The entire rest of the universe. You see, that's how this works. The word Priusist describes anybody who owns a Prius, anyone who meets the criterion necessary to be a Priusist. We can describe them with the adjective Priusistic. On the other hand, anything at all that does not meet that criterion is apriusistic, and therefore an apriusist. And the same can be said of the words atheist and theist, because theist describes any subject which meets the necessary criterion of believing in at least one God, and atheist describes anything else that does not qualify. And do you know what doesn't qualify? The entire rest of the universe. Now, I can already hear some of you typing furiously away without watching the entire video first. And by the way, stop that. It's rude and makes you look like a dipshit when what you're screaming about gets addressed later in the video. But I'm pretty sure I know what a lot of you are trying to say already. I've heard it all 1,000 times before. Whoa, 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 my friend. We're only talking about people here. Thinking, conscious, knowing beings. Alright, if that's the way you want to play it, fine. So now the two necessary criteria for being a theist is to be a thinking, knowing, feeling, conscious being, and to believe in at least one God. Well, now you're doubly screwed, because if subject under scrutiny Y doesn't meet both necessary criteria to be a theist, then they're not one. And do you know what doesn't meet those criteria? The entire rest of the universe. This is what logic dictates. To insist that to qualify as an atheist, you also have to meet one of the necessary criteria to be a theist, rather than failing to meet all of the necessary criteria to be a theist, is essentially special pleading. Now I can already hear some of you losing your shit and typing away, saying, but ist has to refer to a person, therefore an atheist is a person. Nope. Because if atheists described what something is instead of what it isn't, you'd be totally correct. But all atheism says is, see those people over there that are theists? Well, everything over here is not. The only necessary criterion for being an atheist is to not meet all of the necessary criteria for being a theist. If theist requires that you be a person, that doesn't mean atheist has to as well. So to those of you already losing your shit and typing away going, what, do you think babies and rocks are atheists? Yeah, I do. Why? Because they don't meet the necessary criteria to be theists. And believe me, I get it. When some of you say that it's absurd to think of babies and rocks as atheists, I understand. It even seems a little weird to me too. But that doesn't make it wrong, and it doesn't make it illogical. And if you've followed this chain so far, you can see why it actually is the case. Because you know what group babies and rocks fall into. The entire rest of the universe. Rather than absurd, the point about babies and rocks being atheists is more like largely irrelevant. The only time it ever really comes up, the only time it's ever actually important, is when we encounter one of those theists who says, you're not actively opposing my God, you just don't believe? Well, you're not an atheist, you're just an agnostic. That's when it starts to become important, when you want to point out that no, not believing is plenty to be an atheist. But other than that, it's largely not relevant or important. However, there are some people out there who want to say, oh, it's not relevant? Well then, out of the definition it goes. Nope. Because not being particularly important doesn't make it not true. Babies and rocks still don't meet all of the necessary criteria to be theists, and therefore, they're part of the entire rest of the universe. Can you tell I love doing that?
Now, two things recommend this definition. Firstly, it does not entail absurdities like atheist rocks.
Yeah, covered that. Spin on.
Secondly, it does not try to evade the burden of justification. An explicit attribution of likelihood is a necessary condition for being an atheist. Look, it's here in the second conjunct.
Well, as I said, you screwed that up when you wrote it. But I hate it when people try to hold me to something that I said and misspoke, so I'll take it the way you intend. But I still say that it's absurd to insist on this particular criterion, because what you've just done, intentionally or not, is added a shit ton of extra baggage onto what it takes to qualify as being not in the group that calls themselves theists. And you know what's outside that group called theists? Wait for it. The entire rest of the universe. So frankly, adding on all that extra baggage is just cheating. Because what you've done here is made it so that you have to justify the reason you don't believe and to what degree before you can actually qualify as an atheist, as someone who is not in the theist group. But one's absence of belief doesn't always come from mental weightlifting. Perhaps someone just doesn't give a shit. Maybe someone's never been exposed to the concept. There are a lot of reasons why belief may not be present that has nothing to do with having thought it all the way through. Now, I don't disagree with you that people who have done their homework and still aren't believers do have a certain burden of justification. Not a burden of proof, but justifying why they still hold the position that they do. But where I don't agree is making it a necessary part of qualifying as an atheist. I see it more as a point of honesty, of credibility, rather than a necessary criterion. Now, what we have here is not just a semantic argument, it's also an argument about identity as well. Because what I'm hearing him say is, I want to be part of a group whose non-belief in deities is the result of study and critical philosophical thought. I don't wish to be associated with those whose non-belief is the result of the absence of faith we're all born with. I want to be proud of my atheism. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but that sure is the message being conveyed. But the thing is, you can be proud of your atheism and still have the definition be a lack of belief in deities. That's where the semantics comes in. Now let's suppose, just for a moment, hypothetically, that atheist really is an umbrella term that covers every non-believer in deities. All of them. The entire rest of the universe. Your group, the one you want to be so proud of, the one that you want atheists to refer to, would be the explicit atheists, or the strong atheists, or both. Babies and rocks, on the other hand, implicit atheists, soft atheists. Now we have the universal inclusion that logic dictates, and with the application of an adjective or two, we can have the divisions that you feel are so important. Mission accomplished. But for some reason, a lot of the people I've spoken to find this to be some sort of horrible burden, that adding adjectives to specify what kind of atheist they are is somehow anathema to them. I've asked them why and never gotten a good answer. In fact, more often than not, the question went completely ignored, 100% unanswered. But the few answers I did get essentially said that adjectives would make the whole idea way too complicated, that what we need is for atheists to mean just one specific tiny little sliver of the non-believing community. Frankly, I find this ridiculous. It's kind of like saying that from now on the term ice cream refers only to Rocky Road, and every other flavor of frozen dairy treat needs to have its own individual name as well. If, on the other hand, you said ice cream, subcategory tutti frutti, or atheism, subcategory explicit, well, now you have the specificity you want without excluding everything else that qualifies under the umbrella term. That makes 1,000,000 times more sense. Now you're able to succinctly describe your position and to describe other possible positions under the same basic heading without a lot of linguistic hoop jumping. Because if every possible way to not believe in a deity has to have its own individual unique term that makes everything sound unrelated despite all being about unbelief in gods, well, now you've made it so much more confusing. So while I've gotten one reason why umbrella term plus adjectives is a bad thing, I'm still waiting for a good reason.
As you can probably tell, I'm exasperated by the popularity of the lack of belief definition.
Well, then I guess we're fortunate that your grumpiness has no effect on what words mean, or on the entire rest of the universe. I had to do that just one more time. And speaking of time, until the next one, fellow space travelers, this is BionicDance saying don't run on automatic. Instead, please, think.